see who we've got. Oh, here they come. Welcome, everyone. We're just going to take a minute to let people sign in. We have a lot of people signed up, and we will get started shortly.
Caroline, how many people did sign up all told?
Over 150.
Wow, that's great. Well, certainly a popular topic.
Oops. There we go. All right, we're at 7 o'clock. I'm just going to give it to 7:01 and then we'll get started. All right, we've got 62 people in here, so I think we'll get started. So welcome, everyone. We're going to get right into the program shortly. I just want to say a few words about your hosts, Cadence River Education Alliance and the Brunswick-Topsham Land Trust. Many of you may know CREA as an organization that provides nature-based education to public school students and other community programs. So rather than going into the details, I thought it would be most interesting to just give you a quick example of our work this fall. We've had a lot of fourth graders coming to our ecology center and the Cadence River Nature Preserve to study geology. And over the course of a morning, they visit old quarries where feldspar was mined. They grind rocks into sand to learn about weathering. They look at sand under microscopes. They learn about Maine rocks and minerals and a lot more. And as part of that trip, our teachers, we have 2 educators that lead those, and our teachers take them on a hike to the Cadence River so they can see erosion in action. And as part of that, the fourth graders are given the opportunity to do a solo hike. It's a very short hike, a solo hike, but a solo hike down a short, very densely vegetated side trail. And so we space them out by, a couple of seconds each with teachers posted along the way. And the students come out and they come out to this expansive view of the Cadence River at one of its wider points. And if we're lucky and it's sunny, there's just a gorgeous view of the river and it's sparkling and murmuring. And a lot of the students just stop in amazement at this view. And many of them gasp or say, oh my God. And then they're invited to sit by the river for a few minutes as their classmates finish their hike down to this spot. And it's a really special moment for not only for the students, but also for our educators and for the classroom teachers who are along for the trip. And I describe it just to demonstrate that these experiences are about a lot more than teaching content. We're also building confidence. We're tapping into students' sense of wonder, and we're identifying the natural world as a source of interest and connection. And following one class that visited us last week, the teacher reported afterwards that half of her students said it was the first time they'd ever gone hiking. So I just wanted to describe that as a way of saying that those are the kinds of experiences that we at CREA and our partner BTLT are creating behind the scenes in the community. Oh, I forgot to show, wait a minute, sorry. There's our, the slide that I forgot to show. That's just a list of some of the other things that we do. And just a few words about BTLT. You can see on the left side those stats about the properties that BTLT is conserving in our communities. And it's just worth noting that having these local places where people can easily access many different landscapes and habitats is just really important. And their conservation priorities, which you can see there, they're also both conserving and supporting local agriculture. They're providing water access to people who make their livelihood on the water. It's just, they have many wonderful community programs. And if you haven't visited some of their special places, the Labyrinth in the Woods and the community garden at Crystal Spring Farm in Brunswick, the farmers market, I hope you get a chance to, because they're very special places that are open to everyone. So if you appreciate living in communities where conservation and the natural world are valued, we hope you'll support our work, which contribute a lot, I think, to that sense of value. So lastly, I just want to thank both Fred, our moderator tonight, and all of our presenters. These are all very busy people who have a lot on their plates, and we really appreciate their willingness to share their time and expertise with us. We know this is cutting into their probably precious evening. So a huge thank you to all of you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce Fred, our moderator, who's looking like the airline pilot there with his headphones,
Right.
or traffic
Yeah.
controller.
I'm strapped in, ready to go, ready to take this flight.
So Fred is volunteer project manager for the On the Pathway to 100% Clean Energy, which is a business-led, non-political, nonprofit Maine project. He's co-founder of Spark Applied Efficiency, a full-service electrical and mechanical contracting firm in South Portland. He established Spark in 2014 with Pat Kuhn to help people create more valuable and sustainable businesses through efficiency. They're an Efficiency Maine qualified partner. They install and service a wide range of devices and systems designed to increase efficiency and help commercial clients transition to clean energy. So Fred has a background in law. He initially working as a corporate counsel in North Carolina, and then when he came to Maine, he started FW Horch Sustainable Goods and Supply, which many of you may remember from Brunswick. He sold that before starting Spark. And now he and his family live in Brunswick in an historic home powered by 100% clean energy.
Great,
So
thanks.
I'm gonna mute myself and turn it over to Fred.
Great, thank you, Caroline. I want to thank you and Kriya and VTLT for hosting this. This is a very exciting day for me because I get so many questions about community solar, and I can't see the audience, but I hope there's many people I know in the audience. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. I think what we're going to do before I introduce our panelists, Caroline mentioned that we can somehow take a poll of everybody who's signed in. So Caroline, if you can help us figure out how to do that. The idea here is that we wanted to see what people, okay, it's popped up on my screen. How much do you know about solar? So if folks could take a moment and just answer this, that'll help our panelists sort of, pitch the, what flight level are we flying at? Yeah, I think we have a couple more questions. So that's the first question. How much you know about solar? And I guess we'll give you, Caroline, you're going to tell me when we're going to switch it, right?
We've got 73 of 85 have participated. Last chance.
Okay. Going once, going
think,
twice, last call.
All right, I'm ending it and I'm going to share the results.
All right, fantastic. So I can see, like, it looks like most people, can you all see this, all the panelists? Or it looks like a fair amount. Most people say they know a fair amount about solar. So that's fantastic. More than half know a fair amount or a lot about solar. Okay, our next question for y'all is your personal experience with solar. Can we get that question? Okay, so the choices are, I have solar on my house or property. I know at least two of us on the panel do. We have solar on our own houses. Other options are community solar projects. You signed up for one, but you don't have your power yet, or maybe you're thinking about it. So we'll give folks a chance to answer that question. And wow, so it looks like in the early running, a lot of folks have solar already, like at least a third already have solar.
I appreciate, Fred, that
Okay.
there is no, I'm not interested in solar.
Right, you have to be interested. You're at this talk, right? So they've self-selected. The folks that don't care at all are not showing up tonight. All right, so that's our second question. We have one more question, and that's sort of a feeling question. I think we're going to do this one at the beginning and maybe at the end too. So the third question is, how do you feel about solar farms in Maine? And then the choices are: you're opposed to them, you're in favor, leaning either way. We're kind of curious to know who might show up, if there's some people that really hate solar farms and just want to give us a hard time. Boy, it looks like almost everyone are at least leaning in favor or are in favor. So that's great. We'll give that. All right, 90% participation rate. Okay, well, great. So we have a sense of a lot of folks here, a lot of folks interested in solar, obviously, and a lot of people know about solar, and then generally a pretty positive feeling. So thank you all for taking that poll. We've got three very knowledgeable panelists with us, but I quickly wanted to give the plan for the evening to everybody knows what we're doing. It's not going to be a PowerPoint presentation. It's going to be really a free-flowing discussion. So hoping we can really help the people who are attending this kind of reach your own decision, make an informed decision about solar farms in Maine. So you might be, considering participating in a solar program. So we have a lot of folks that have said that that's why they're here. They're interested, considering community solar. You might be affected by it. You might have a neighbor who has a solar farm, or you might be thinking about putting a solar farm on your own property. And then, of course, we're all voters. We're all, living in Maine, and there already are questions, policy questions, and probably will continue to be those. So that's the goal of tonight's program, is to help us to share information so you can understand some of the benefits and some of the impacts of solar farms in Maine. So we'll start with some prepared questions. There is a way, I think at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. So if you see that, if you have any questions you would like to pose to the panelists, you can put them in the Q&A, and then Caroline will help make sure that I see them, and we'll get them in front of the moderators. We're going to go till about 8:30. And again, we'll try to wrap it up so we can take a quick poll at the end of the evening and see if anybody's feelings have changed. And again, we're just going to really try to have a free-flowing discussion that covers a lot of ground. And we know probably by the end of this, there'll be more questions. We might raise more questions than we answer, which is, fine. So we're going to do the best we can for the next, hour or so. And but it's a big topic, so we can't cover anything. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. I'll read a quick bio for each of them, and then we'll start the conversation. So Fortunat Mueller is president of Revision Energy. He manages company operations across Revision's residential, commercial, and service business units. He's deeply involved in advancing the company's mission to decarbonize New England's economy while serving customers, vendors, the community, and the planet. Fortunat received both his master's and bachelor's of science in mechanical engineering from Brown University, with concentration in thermodynamics and fluid mechanics, and he's a licensed professional engineer here in Maine and New Hampshire. He serves on Maine's Climate Council Equity Subcommittee, and his own home sports an 8-kilowatt solar electric system connected to the grid with a single Tesla Powerwall to provide backup power to the well pump, boiler, and other critical loads. And he heats primarily with a combination of Mitsubishi air source heat pumps and a wood stove, which are backed up by a fully automatic pellet boiler. And his domestic hot water system is also solar. So it sounds like Fortunat have a lot in common. That pretty much describes my system, except I'm not at 8 kilowatts, I'm at 3 kilowatts. So he's got a nice big solar system on his own house. So that's Fortunat. Next person on our panel is Adam DeRozier. He's Vice President of Electric Operations at Central Maine Power. He's been there in that role since July 2021. He oversees the daily maintenance and operation of the company's electric system, as well as emergency preparedness and restoration efforts following storms. Adam's been with CMP since 2008. He's held a variety of management positions, most recently managing engineering and construction of the New England Clean Energy Connect project. So I'm sure there was a lot involved in that role. We're delighted Adam could be with us. Welcome, Adam. And then our third panelist is Brooke Barnes. He is a principal in environmental services at Stantec. He has more than 25 years of experience in regulatory and the permitting fields. He has held leadership positions at Maine DEP. He's trained future leaders at Maine Management Institute and served as counsel to Governor Angus King. Recently, he has been involved in regulatory reviews of 6 new wind projects in Maine, and his background in sociology and law gives him a unique perspective on regulatory processes, including understanding the role of the public in those processes. So welcome, Brooke. All right, so here's the first question for you panelists. It's going to be a two-parter. I'm going to read a definition of a solar farm, and then I'll ask you your thoughts on this. So here's a definition of a solar farm. It's an array of dozens, hundreds, or thousands of solar photovoltaic panels, typically on the ground in a rural location, connected to the public electricity grid so the energy produced can be used anywhere in the grid service territory. For example, solar farms in Maine can power homes and businesses throughout New England. So my question to you guys, first, is this a good working definition of a solar farm? And second, could you share a little about your personal and professional connection to solar farms as you define them? Got that? So I'll start, I'll just go around the screen here. I see Brooke first on my screen. So Brooke, you want to answer that question? Good definition, and what's your connection to solar farms?
I guess I struggle a little with the definition because I think there's a big distinction between dozens of panels and thousands of panels. My experience is with the thousands of panels. I work at Stantec in Topsham. There are about 45 of us there. We have done the environmental work on the ground as well as engineering design and permitting for about 35 projects ranging from 2 megawatts to 110 megawatts. That's 14 acres to 800 acres. Here in Maine. So I think there's a big distinction between a project that is a few panels on a corner lot on a DOT intersection or a 20 to 40 acre solar farm. I think of that as closer to the solar farm by my definition.
Oh, sorry, Fortunate, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree with Brooke. I think I would narrow the definition slightly, Fred, from the one you read, in two ways. So one, I think typically when people think of solar farms, they think of solar projects that are not co-located with load. That is to say that they are not in the same place where the power is being consumed. So if I put panels in my backyard, whether I'm an individual or a business, I think that's just a ground-mounted solar system, not a solar farm. I think a project that is sort of standalone, that has its own utility service, is a solar farm. And I typically think of solar farms as being DG scale, that is, say, distribution connected, not transmission connected, and that the stuff that is very large, some of the stuff that Brooke works on in the 100 megawatt range, is, I don't know, we call it utility scale solar. I guess you could call it utility scale solar farm. But I think most people, when they think about solar farms, they think about DG scale, which is 5 megawatts and under, and standalone, not co-located with load.
Yeah, and can you tell us a little bit your connection to solar farms as you define them?
Sure. Yeah, and so so Revision has been building solar in Maine for 20 years at all scales, ranging from residential rooftops up to large DG projects, community scale projects. Until 4 or 5 years ago, the largest of those projects was in the roughly megawatt range because of the way the policy in Maine was. More recently, those projects are in the 5 to 7 megawatt range. And so Revision is a full service contractor. We do development, engineering, finance, and then construction and service for projects of all scales, ranging from rooftop stuff to sort of the medium, I guess, a large commercial, but not utility scales.
Great. All right. Thanks, Fortunate. Okay, Adam, your turn.
Yeah, I mean, Brooke and Fortunate really covered it. I would put solar farms, solar arrays into those same two categories. To me, from the utility perspective, we always consider utility scale solar connecting to the transmission system, and the DG size 5 megawatts or less connecting to the distribution system. So really two different processes for interconnecting those two different size solar farms or fields. And yeah, I think the definition for the most part was pretty spot on.
Yeah, and so tell us a little bit about CMP's role in all this. So, you know, Fortunate builds them, Brooke helps site them. What does CMP do in this whole process?
Yeah, so really my team is focused every day on operating and providing safe, reliable power on both the transmission and the distribution system. In the last few years, we've seen a significant increase in the request to interconnect solar to both the transmission and the distribution system. So really, I mean, the biggest distinction for us is that the distribution system historically has always been load serving for our customers. And with the integration of distributed generation at the 5 megawatts or less level, it's really changed the way we operate the distribution system, which comes with complexities. So really, that's where our focus is learning how to adapt and change the way we operate the system to interconnect these solar projects.
All right, great. So we've talked a little bit about scale. From CNP's perspective, what's a small project and what's a large project? Like, if I have a small solar farm, what would the size of that be? And then what's the biggest, solar farms you guys have in your queue?
Yeah, so with the process we have, we basically have from a level 1 to a level 4 application. So a level 1 could be as small as a rating of a 5 to 8 kW system that might be on somebody's roof at their house, and then up to a level 4, which could be up to 80, 100 megawatts that's connecting to a large substation or transmission line. For instance, Farmington, Maine, I think that's a 75 megawatt project that was interconnected to the transmission system up there.
Cool. So Fortunat, can you help explain these terms we've been throwing about kWs and kilowatts and MWs and megawatts, and you've done a lot of different sizes, you say. Kind of help people understand what that really means. What's like I have a 3 kilowatt scale system in my house. You've got an 8 kilowatt. And then these larger projects, you just mentioned a 75 megawatt. Kind of help people understand what they're hearing when they hear like an 8 megawatt or a 75 megawatt. What's the scale mean?
Yeah, sure. So this is definitely a source of some confusion for people, in part because when you talk about solar system size, we use this nameplate rating size. So that's the amount of power that system makes at noon on a sunny day, at some standard test condition. And so, Fred, your 3 kilowatt system probably consists of 10 to 12 panels, maybe more if it's a couple of years old, and is a kind of on the smaller end of a residential system. And so kW is kilowatt, 1,000 watts, right? So each panel today is between 300 and 400 watts. A few years ago, it was between 200 and 300 watts. And so our typical residential system size is 7 to 10 kilowatts today. So something like 20 to 30 panels or modules at a time. And the largest of the distribution connected solar projects are 5 megawatts. That's the limit for connecting to the distribution. I see from Caroline the question, what is DG? DG means distributed generation, which often is used synonymously with, as Adam said, projects that are connected to the distribution system as opposed to the transmission system. And so those projects, the 5 megawatt projects, are on the order of 20 to 25 acres in size, and call it 15,000 panels or so at a time. Plus or minus.
So if you hear megawatts, it's 1,000 times bigger than a kilowatt. So just scale up things 1,000 times bigger. So it can be a very just one letter difference, a kW versus an MW, right? So they're vastly different in size.
Right, and I think you will just also, Fred, you will hear people refer to the annual or the daily or the lifetime production of the systems, which will be given in megawatt hours or kilowatt hours, right? Which is a unit of energy, whereas kilowatt and megawatt is a unit of power.
Right. That we can talk more about that, perhaps the difference between kilowatts and kilowatt hours. But basically, if you take a kilowatt for an hour, you multiply the power, multiply that by the time, then you get the kilowatt hours. So it kind of makes sense if you understand that. You're just how long is that solar panel in the sun? The longer it's in the sun, the more energy it's going to make. So people can kind of have that in mind. So Brooke, you mentioned the scale that you operate at. Remind us what size projects you're looking at, and you were thinking this is the scale of a solar farm in your mind.
Right, and what's been mentioned is some solar farms can plug into the existing distribution lines, the 34.5 kilovolt lines and the 12.5 kilovolt lines that run along our roadsides. And some projects, like the 5 megawatt projects, can plug directly into those lines and therefore feed their electrons into the system. Larger projects, one we recently did in Unity Township, is about 800 acres, about 110 megawatts. And they had to build a high voltage transmission line to take their power to the nearest substation and then connect into Adam's network with CMP. And so the size of the project is highly variable. The smaller projects are looking for openings, and Adam can explain this more, but they're looking for openings in the CMP system where there's room at a substation for additional megawatts to be added. Developers are looking around for land in that area and saying, oh, we could put in 5 megawatts to this substation. Here's 40 acres of land that we can lease. This is starting to look like a good site for a solar project. And then they'll check in with CMP to make sure that that space is available on the substation. And then bang, you've got a distributed generation project that's feeding into the transmission or the distribution lines that connect to that substation. On the very large projects, they're almost always going to have to build their own transmission lines, and a transmission line is high voltage. I saw someone had asked the question. That's like 115 kV kilovolts. It's a big transmission line. And a large project would have to build their transmission line, which can be a mile, can be 10 miles, can be 15 miles, to connect to a substation, and usually have to build their own substation to change the voltage from the solar project up to that high voltage before it's transmitted to the central main power substation. So it's an elaborate dance of getting the right voltages in the right places to the right point in the central main power reversing system.
Great. I want to come back to the scale question with you in a minute, but Adam, I want to turn to you now, and maybe you can help explain these substations and distribution system versus transmission in a little more detail, because a lot of folks kind of have a general sense there's wires going everywhere. We see these really big towers, and those are transmitting electricity. And we mentioned these wires along the street, but maybe you could help people understand how the system works. Like, where does it end between like Maine and New Hampshire? And where does it end between Brunswick and Topsham? And just sort of the scale of, like, if I built a solar farm and I plugged it into my local substation, how does that all work together versus what Brooks is saying? And like, I build a whole new substation for my own massive farm. Could you kind of explain how this whole system kind of works together?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Maine, we are part of the ISO New England transmission system. So really taking that from the very high, the 1,000-foot level, we have what we call 345 kV or 345,000 volt transmission lines. These are the very large transmission lines you see cross over 295, 95. Basically, they run from the Maine, New Hampshire border all the way up through central Maine, mid-coast Maine, up to New Brunswick, Canada. So those are the lines that are capable of moving large amounts of power and being part of that network transmission grid. They move power every day from Canada down into New England and from New England up into Maine. From there, they go to substations. And at those substations, that voltage is then stepped down from the 345 kV down to 115 kV, which is a lower voltage transmission line that we have, again, networked throughout the central main power and Versant territory. That also connects to New Hampshire and connects to New Brunswick, Canada. From there, the transmission lines main focus is moving large amounts of power around the network. So from there, it gets stepped down again at substations to 34 kV transmission. So at central main power, we have 34 kV transmission and we have 34 kV distribution. So 34 kV transmission runs from those substations to other smaller substations via corridors or right-of-ways, basically the right-of-ways you see through the woods, through the farm fields. I mean, most of the time they do run off-road. We don't typically build transmission lines roadside just because of the protection and the accessibility for damage to those lines from vehicles and storms and trees. So from there, the power is distributed from those substations at the 34 kV distribution or the 12 kV distribution level. And those are the lines that you see run along the roads here in the state of Maine that feed our homes. They can either be 3-phase or single phase. It's really dependent on if there's 3 wires on top of the pole or 1 wire. And that's the voltage and the power that feeds our home. So on the solar side, as Brooke and Fortunat described, that depending on the size of the solar field or the solar farm, depends on where it connects to the system, whether it's on the distribution system or the transmission system.
Great, thank you very much. So getting back to you, Brooke, you mentioned that most of your project, I believe, they are the scale where they'll plug in directly to the transmission. They're those higher voltages. They don't necessarily need to use the distribution system that's already built. They might be building their own transmission. Am I understanding you correctly?
Well, most by number, most of the projects, the distributed generation projects that Fortunat mentioned, are plugging into the distribution system, the three-phase power that Adam pointed out. So when you're driving around these days and you're seeing solar projects popping up everywhere that are in the 20 to 40 acre size, they are primarily plugging directly into the distribution system that you see roadside, the 3 wires on the top. It's only the larger ones, the 40, the 60, the 100 megawatt projects that have to plug into the transmission system.
Great. So obviously, if you had to build your own transmission line and design your own substation, that adds a lot of cost. There must be some sort of economies of scale to this. I wonder if you could sort of talk to us about, is it really a lot cheaper to build a massive one and build your own transmission, or is it cheaper, or is it close in cost to sprinkle these smaller farms among the existing distribution system?
And I can't say I'm an expert at all on the economics of it, but the cost of building a transmission line, 1 mile, 2 miles, 5 miles, 10 miles, and the cost of a multi-million-dollar substation require that you have a very big footprint. You can't have a small project that then has to support a transmission line and a new substation. You can have a small project that readily plugs into the existing system, into the existing space that's available at a substation. So those can be done, much. What's the profit margin in the two? I don't know. That's not my area. But the smaller ones can be put into the system much easier than a large system.
In the sense that you don't need to build a new infrastructure, but there is the restriction though, because you have to find a space, right? I mean,
Exactly.
they're easier in one way, but harder in the other way.
That's
Fortune, I
right.
wonder if you could talk to us about the economics of this. You do all scales, so how do you think about this in terms of one big project would be cheaper to do than lots of little projects, but there's some countervailing factors, right, in terms of the economies of scale and the costs of all these things.
There are, yeah, Fred, like you said, there are countervailing factors, both on the cost and potentially also on the value that the systems can produce. So, I should clarify that when Brooks says small systems, he's still talking about, I think, what most people would think of as large systems, at least for the Maine world, which is right, 20 acres of solar is not a small system. It's not a couple of panels in your backyard. But yeah, the benefit of small projects is that they are located on the existing distribution system in most cases. And though they have to pay for the cost of upgrading the system to absorb their capacity, usually sort of by design, they are located in places where those upgrades are relatively minimal. And so you have essentially just the cost of building the solar project. If you're building a larger project, in the 50, 100 megawatt scale, utility scale project, you're almost always building a transmission line and a dedicated substation. But you are building at 10 or even 20x the scale, and so you do see a pretty significant reduction in cost, probably a 40% cheaper capital cost.
Gotcha.
Plus all the transaction costs, right? If you think about it, some of the things, land due diligence and financing costs and lawyers and all that other stuff, you pay for whether you're building 20 panels, 200 panels, 2,000 panels, or 200,000 panels.
Yeah. So you mentioned the 5 megawatt threshold was something sort of regulatory. Are there some non-regulatory but market or just sort of limitations physically that would you could do a system up to this size, and then once you're above this size, you got to be looking at a different way? Are there any natural sort of differences you could in scale that would kind of divide these projects into certain different categories, or is it seamless from 1 kW up to 1,000 megawatts. It's just pick where you want to go.
And I'm sure Brooke has something to say about this too. There are breakpoints all through that range. None of them are natural breakpoints. They're all policy. And
Okay.
so, you know, there are changes in the way projects are treated under net metering at 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt, and 5 megawatt. There are changes in the way that 5 megawatt is the maximum to be connected to the distribution system. So above that, you have to be connected to the transmission system, or you are in an interstate jurisdictional interconnection as opposed to a state jurisdictional interconnection. And then the other breakpoint is not on system size, but on acreage. At 20 acres in Maine, you cross the threshold into a different level of DEP permitting. And so
Okay.
just under 20 acres, which is kind of like a 3 to 4 megawatt project, you can duck some of the DEP permitting requirements that exist for larger projects.
Okay. So there's some pretty significant regulatory breakpoints, but they're not necessarily technical in nature. They're sort of put in place for public policy reasons. Yeah. Okay.
Right. And Fortnot mentioned the 20 acres. That's the site location of development law. And if you occupy more than 20 acres, so that's everything to do with your project from your corridor for your electrical and your roads and your fence line and your cleared area. If you add all that up and it's over 20 acres, then you have to go through a site location of development permitting process with DEP, which costs a lot more and takes a lot more time, requires a lot more survey and much more intensive process. So there's a lot of 19.9 acre projects where they're generating as many megawatts as they can within 19.9 acres. Something, Fortnite, I'd like to hear from you is, in the beginning, when this started, even beginning, I'm saying 2 years ago, when policy changed here in Maine and a lot of these projects were encouraged, what was the panel size then compared to what the panel size is now? Because I think that the amount of megawatts that people were designing for 2 years ago, they could barely squeeze in 4.5 megawatts in less than 20 acres. I think today they can get more than 20 megawatts or 5 megawatts in 20 acres. Is that right, Fortnite?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of variables there. So one is the panel efficiency. So the sort of power you can get out of the same square footage increases incrementally, every year by a couple of percent. In the last few years, we've also seen the format, the size of individual panels grow. And so that sort of lets you put more on the same rack, if not on the same square footage. And then the other variable that you can play with in terms of power density on the site is spacing between rows. If you are not concerned about a little bit of inter-row shading in the winter, or you're willing to set the panels at a lower angle, you can shrink the inter-row spacing and you can cram more kilowatt hours off the same site, even at the cost of some hours of shade during some periods of the year. And every developer financier sort of trades that off differently, depending on the fixed cost and the land cost and sort of what the public policy reports.
And there are two kinds of foundations, right? The fixed tilt, where the panel basically stays in one direction, the optimal direction, and then one that turns with the sun. What's the relative advantage of each one of those?
Well, so the difference between those two, and right, so you have fixed tilt modules, then you have tracking modules, and the tracker modules are set so the rows are north-south, and so they track the sun from the eastern horizon to the western horizon through the day. And so on a tracking system, you generate more kilowatt hours for the same kilowatts because you are following the sun across the sky. So you get about 25 to 30, single axis tracking, you get about 25 to 30% more production out of the same array. The spacing is different because, if you're trying to track the sun all the way down to the horizon, now the array casts a relatively long shadow, and so you want to maintain some spacing between rows that maybe is longer than the spacing you have on fixed tilt. But when modules are expensive, tracking makes a ton of sense because you squeeze more kilowatts every module. As modules or land gets cheap, then tracking gets harder to justify because you might as well just add some panels rather than add the complexity of moving parts.
Great. Hey, I want to get back to some of those technical points about solar panels and how they work. But Adam, I wanted to ask you if there are any natural breakpoints that you see from the grid operation side, are there scales of solar farms that are easy to integrate into your mix or difficult? What's your perspective in terms of how easy is it to digest a solar farm of different sort of sizes?
Yeah, so I mean, really the way this works is when a developer has a proposed solar farm that they're looking to build and interconnect, they start with an application to our interconnection group that puts them in the queue. From there, it goes into a study. So during that study is where we're going to determine what's available for capacity at the location where they're looking to interconnect, and what necessary upgrades are required to either interconnect them at that point or to get the power they're generating to a transmission line or through a substation. And as you add more and more solar farms, say, connecting on the same distribution line, that study becomes more and more important because that energy is going to flow onto the transmission system. So with that comes cost. So we work very closely with the developers through that study phase to identify what cost might be necessary to upgrade certain components of the system to allow that farm to generate what their nameplate is for size. So that's really where it becomes a make or break point for the developers and understanding the costs related to their interconnection.
Yeah, so if I understand this correctly, the developer comes to you, says, we want to do this project. You say, great, we need to study this. And then you kind of get back to them and say, you know what, to put it there, it's going to cost this much. Do you offer them, hey, if you put it over here, it's going to be a lot cheaper? Or is it up to the developer to sort of like figure out where else they would want to go if it's too expensive to go where they wanted to go at first?
Yeah, so we do have those conversations. And one thing we do provide now and it's on our website to developers is we have capacity maps of our distribution system out there for developers to go and look and see where we have available capacity on the distribution system, which will help them in siting these sites so that they're not buying property where it's going to cost them a lot of money to interconnect versus building closer to a substation where there's capacity and saving some cost on the interconnection point.
Yeah. Could you kind of briefly characterize this map? Where is it cheap right now to put solar and where is it more expensive to put solar in Maine? Is there any way to sort of, in general, give people some advice about that?
Yeah, so just as an economy of scale, I mean, we've got over 750 projects that have submitted applications in the state of Maine to interconnect, or in CMP service territory to interconnect to the system. And that's close to 2,000 megawatts of potential solar generation. CMP's peak load during a year is 1,700 megawatts. So we've got enough solar in applications to account for all of our load if it was all generating.
Wait, can you say that again? Did you say that you have more people applying to put more solar on the grid than we actually use? Is that what I'm hearing?
There's over 2,000 megawatts of either in construction or in the queue to be studied and potentially interconnected. And our peak load at CMP is 1,700 megawatts.
So that begs the question, why are people wanting to put so much solar in Maine?
Well, I mean, and I think Fortunato could speak to this more. I mean, the output of the solar farms isn't always what the nameplate is. So even though the total capacity might be more, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be generating at that level every day of the week.
Gotcha.
And a lot of the development we've seen has been at that 5 megawatt or less level due to the net metering arrangements that are out there right now for the developers. So that's really the largest majority of the projects that we're seeing. And the maps are helping the developers hopefully find locations where the upgrades are going to be significantly less for them to interconnect those projects.
That's fantastic. So
Fred, I'd love to, if you don't mind, just weigh in
Sure.
on that question, because this goes to the question of megawatts versus megawatt hours again.
Right. Yeah.
Right. When Adam says there are 2,000 megawatts of projects being studied compared to 1,700 megawatts of peak load, that is peak. That's what the solar can make at the peak day. It's not what it makes in a year, right? If you look at the Maine Climate Council goals and you say, what does Maine need in order to get to 100% clean energy by 2040, 2050, including beneficial electrification, it's about we need about 7,500 megawatts of solar. Solar is going to be about, if you want to go to full clean energy, solar is going to be about a third of that. Offshore wind and hydro will be the other 2/3. So we need about 7,500 megawatts of PV across all scales to meet Maine's load. And it will also be true, and some of the projects that Brooke is talking about and that Brooke has worked on are actually projects built in Maine to serve load elsewhere in New England, because necessarily states like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts will not have the available capacity and land to build as much solar as they need. And so
Yeah.
some of the biggest projects built in Maine today are actually serving load elsewhere in New England. And
Right.
which frankly, I just want to say is a good thing, right? I heard somebody once say, we don't grow potatoes in Aroostook County to eat them all, right? we grow them to sell them to the rest of the country, which is a good thing. That's commerce, and
Sure.
it's economically beneficial for the state.
Yeah, yeah. I want to ask a few more questions about this and then get into some siting and sort of land use issues. But while we're sort of talking about megawatt hours versus megawatts, and you were talking about tracking all this, like, fortunately, maybe you can just like review sort of the characteristics of solar power and how it differs from other types of renewable energy. For example, solar power produces what's called direct current, which then needs to be inverted into, other, and it only produces during the day, that sort of thing. So like when you're thinking about, like somebody says, I want to use solar power for my house. And I get this question a lot. It's like, how does the solar farm deliver that solar power to my house, right? Like people have this idea of like the potatoes, like I buy my potatoes from this farm and I get those potatoes and I eat those potatoes. But if I buy the solar power from that farm, like obviously I'm using energy at night and I'm paying for this solar power at that farm, but how is the energy getting to me at night from that farm? Maybe you could explain, and maybe also Adam, you could sort of help understand, because I think people still don't quite get how this would work. And then maybe we can talk just briefly about the policy that's making this all possible, that net metering policy.
Sure. For community solar projects that are, built at the distribution level, which is, I think, a lot of what we think of when we say solar farms in Maine. Solar, as you say, Fred, produces power during the day when the sun is out. And the policy in Maine, and this is true across most of the country, the policy is such that, you buy a certain number of kilowatt hours from that solar farm. Either you own the farm outright or you have subscription to it. And you are entitled to some portion of its output, its generation. Those kilowatt hours flow out to the grid, and once they are on the grid, kilowatt hours are untrackable, untraceable from one source to another. Right? The nature of the grid is that all of the generators feed into the grid, and all of the loads pull out of it, and you can't trace an electron from one generator to one consumer. But we do that sort of with artificial market constructs and policy. And so, in effect, what happens is my solar project located, 2 miles down the road here, puts electrons on the grid, and I pull them out at my house. Some of those will be pulled out at the same time, and some of those will be pulled out at some different time. And some of the kilowatt hours that my farm made went to serve some neighbor who is not paying. And so that works just fine. That's what net metering, the net in net metering means, that I billed for the net, the difference between what I've produced and what I've consumed over some period. That works just fine until you get to 20, 25, 30% intermittent renewables on the grid, at which point you have to start actually thinking about balancing that generation, either by shaping the load, by storing some of the energy in batteries or pumped hydro and some other sort of storage, or by having a certain amount of dispatchable generation that can be dispatched to fill the valleys. Because while solar and wind and hydro have 3 different production profiles, they don't. None of them produces level power the way that a nuclear plant does. It's worth noting though that of the fossil fuel plants on the grid, virtually none of them run flat out either. Right? They run up and down, all day long too. They run to match the load, while the renewable plants run to match the available energy.
Right. Yeah. Let me get Adam in here, and then I want to talk to some land use and siting stuff and get Brooke to talk about that. But Adam, you mentioned 2,000 megawatts in the queue, and our peak demand has only been 1,700 megawatts. So obviously, when it's sunny and it's noon, these solar farms are just cranking out the power and dumping it on our grid. and then at night they've got nothing. And so then other things happen. So maybe you could kind of explain, how does this work? And is there, like Fortunate mentioned, 20% grid load or 25%, or is there a point at which the way we're doing solar now is just not going to work, and we're going to have to do some load shifting or shaping or some other approach? Maybe tell us where we're likely to run into some issues with the more solar we put onto the grid.
Yeah, and Fortunate pretty much described it. I mean, what the fossil generation or other dispatchable generation that's on the grid kind of makes up for that up and down fluctuation you see with solar generation during the day. When it shuts off at night, the fossil or the other dispatchable resources on the grid make up for that difference, so that we can maintain that steady supply of energy to serve the load. But as we continue to think about where we're going as a state and as an economy, I mean, the big discussion is electrifying our economy. Well, to do so and to do it with renewables, we need to have dispatchable renewables, in my opinion, to make that whole renewable package work. And we need to have the large percentage of solar, on and offshore wind, hydro. They all need to be in the mix and have some of those resources that are dispatchable, battery storage that you can rely on to kind of shave that peak during the day when your load increases and you don't have enough generation to keep up with the load. All of those things need to be part of the overall strategy as we kind of move forward with electrifying our economy.
Yeah. And that word dispatchable, as I understand it, that means you can turn it on and off. Like we're not like,
Yep.
I can't really run out and turn off my solar panel, but if I had a generator, a gas powered generator, I could go fire that sucker up and then turn it off. That's what you mean by dispatchable, right? Something you can turn on and off. You can take the load when you need it and not when you don't, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And to really get to a point where we're actually removing fossil or carbon emitting generation from the New England grid, we have to have dispatchable renewable resources to be able to dispatch off those resources.
Great, thanks. All right, so I'm going to let Caroline jump in just a minute with some questions from the audience. But first, I want to get to the question that a lot of folks have, which is sort of the dual use here. Like, we have a beautiful environment in Maine. We all love it. We like to go hiking. We love to see mountains and valleys and rivers and all that sort of stuff. Caroline mentioned that when they take the kids out for hikes. And then you've got this massive solar farm. And Brooke, I know you do a lot of siting. So maybe you could help us sort of think through those other considerations when people are designing and building solar farms. Are there better and worse places to put them in terms of ecological impact or scenic impact or economic impact that may not be directly related to the power production themselves, but other factors? And how does that sort of play out in the decisions that developers and you're helping them make?
So a developer will usually look at the CMP data that's available to find out where there's space in the grid. Look at the real estate that's available to say, is there a parcel that's the right size? Match those two things up, and then come to a consultant like Stantec and say, hey, can you take a look at this parcel and see, are there rare species? Are there wetlands? Are there botanical things that need to be protected? Deer wintering areas? And in a pretty simple way, these parcels can be triaged. And I would say it's usually 10-1. You kiss a lot of frogs before a developer finds a parcel that says, aha, everything looks to be lining up here.
So if I understood you, that 10-1, you go through 10 parcels and say no for every one parcel you say yes to?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of work that developers do to try to get it right, to try to come up with a parcel that has everything going for it and doesn't have any major stumbling blocks. Absolutely has impacts, whether it's already a hayfield or whether it's a forest. It's going to be a change in use. It may be a farmer that says, look, I'd rather have the lease payment from that hayfield that can keep my farm going than continuing to cut hay on that field. It may be a woodlot owner, a large woodlot owner who says, well, I can take 40 acres and take that out of timber production for the next 30 years, have a steady stream of lease payments, and not have the episodic nature of timber harvest to try to keep my forest in forest and not sell it off for development lots. So there's a lot of economic calculations that go into this from a landowner perspective.
You
Trying to
mentioned
figure out what's the best use of their land.
Right. You mentioned that 30-year horizon. Is that typically what people are thinking of when they build a solar farm? This is going to be a solar farm for the next 30 years if I build it?
Yeah, that's typically a lease term.
Mm-hmm.
Most of these sites are leased, not owned by the developer. So they'll lease a 40-acre site and they'll have a 30-year lease or something like that. At the end of that, it's required that there's a decommissioning bond that runs with the whole life of the project. So if the developer goes bankrupt, if for whatever reason they stop operating, there's a bond that can be called by the community or by the DEP to tear the whole thing down. And at that point, you have a field. And
Understood.
what the next best use for that field is really going to be decided by the landowner, whether it's to go into agriculture, whether it's to have a new solar farm, who knows what the technology will be in 30 years, or some other use, but it
Yeah.
reverts to whatever use the landowner would like to make of it.
That's great. So Fortunate, we've got a question. People have asked me this. What sort of impact, long-lasting impact in terms of like water quality? Are there any toxic materials? Like if I built a solar farm on my back 40 and it's, rain's raining on it and, is there going to be lead in the soil when I'm done? Like what's actually in these panels? What's likely to be the long-term impact? And if this bond gets called, what is that bond money used for? What do you actually do with the panels at the end of their life?
Yeah, the typical solar panels that are installed in these projects in Maine are very inert and harmless products. And so the impacts are, taking the property out of whatever use it was in before, if it was a forest land or if it was a hayfield. So you lose the hayfield unless you find a way to do the two together. But the solar itself, it's steel, aluminum, glass, silicon. There's nothing exotic there, and it is all staying in the product, right? So there's nothing leaching out of solar panels. So there's a slight effect on the way that, say, rainwater moves across the site. But if you look at a solar site, the actual impervious area of the site is very small. Even under the panels is all still grass or dirt, right? And so those sites perk and deal with rainwater just like they used to when they were fields. And then at the end of life, in decommissioning, everything is removed. And so what you had steel piles driven into the ground and they get pulled out of the ground. You had solar panels on racks and they get pulled out and they make their way into the materials recycling stream and they become the next generation of steel and solar. And
so in general, most of it would be pulled back, collected, transported, and recycled and made into new products that use the metal and the glass and whatever else is in those panels. Is that?
Yeah, and the steel recycling is obviously a mature business. Solar panel recycling is a relatively immature business. Solar panels last a long time, and we don't have a lot of 30-year panels. The good news is that the raw material value is such a significant chunk of the overall panel value that there is an economic reason to recycle them, even if there's not a regulatory one. And so we're starting to see, now in Europe and slowly in the U.S., sort of the beginnings of a solar panel recycling supply chain. And I think most industry watchers are super confident that's going to be a robust thing. We're not going to put solar panels in landfills at the end of their lives.
Yeah,
they're going to be recycled into new solar panels.
Yeah, great. Well, Caroline, I want to give you a chance. Are there any questions? I haven't really followed the chat or anything people want to ask from the audience.
Yes, there's a great question, sort of a follow-up to what Brooke said about siting. What are the best ways to steer solar farms to the best locations as opposed to sites that fragment big blocks of wildlife habitat, cutting down carbon storing forests, or using farm fields with prime soils? How might we incentivize use of factory rooftops, parking lots, brownfields, or ag fields that are contaminated with PFAS instead of natural lands? There's a lot in that question.
Yeah, it's a great question.
There really is. And your gut tells you, why do we need to go to these natural areas with these projects? Why can't we put them over parking lots and over buildings and things like that? Well, it would be tiny in comparison to what our need is in order to reach the state's goals. And it would be uneconomic. The cost of the power that would compared to sort of space you would have so many of these small projects, and plugging them all into the grid, it's going to create a headache for Adam. So it's we're not going to get to our goals, I guess, if we just try to say that. Landfills, there aren't that many. Rooftops, little bits and pieces. We talked about 3 kilowatts and 8 kilowatts versus 5 megawatts for a 20-acre solar project. Incentives for getting them out of prime ag soils or out of forest areas or habitat. Be careful, because before you know it, every single location will have some kind of protected status, and there won't be a place for them. We're at a place where we have to act, and that means there's going to be change, and there may be some compromises that are made. We do need to make sure that we're not putting them in special places, and that's sort of the critical issues analysis, the taking a look at what's there, part of what we do as consultants, and what regulators do when they're looking and reviewing these projects, is let's not stick them in our best habitats and our best places.
Yeah, great, thank you.
And one follow-up question, someone wants to know how many solar farms have or might have animal grazing or other agricultural uses happening around them?
In around them or in them, because it's a big difference. Within them, very few in Maine. There are some that are experimenting with it. The regulatory agencies aren't keen on it because of the concern about stormwater runoff from animal trails and things like that that are created. Quite a few projects are planting pollinators, pollinating plants within their arrays in order to encourage butterflies and bees and other pollinators. But there aren't that many true agricultural uses going on within arrays. There's concern about damage and things like that. So not that much, although there are a lot of experiments going on.
So Adam, I wonder if it's similar to what you guys face, keeping the area underneath your transmission and distribution lines. I mean, it seems like it's a similar sort of challenge. You obviously don't want to put a transmission line in a forest, but there could be some dual use below the transmission lines. Is there anything that CMP is doing that might be applicable to what the solar farm people are doing, like management techniques you guys have? And just in general, how do you keep trees from growing? Do you have like sheep that go out there and graze under transmission lines? Do you ever do that? Or is it all mechanical or chemical control?
Yeah, I mean, so we maintain, for the most part, in the transmission line corridors, what we call scrub shrub. So it's really non-capable species are grown or are allowed to grow and then maintained either with herbicide application or spot cutting to make sure the capable species don't grow up into the transmission lines. There's a huge opportunity to create pollinator habitat. So it's something we're exploring with some of our vegetation management contractors to see what we can do to create more pollinator habitat. That's a big thing we're hearing a lot about lately, and transmission line corridors and right-of-ways are a perfect location for some of that habitat. So there's definitely opportunities there, but we haven't approached the idea of animals grazing. I mean, there is a lot of farm fields that are located in our transmission line right-of-ways, and those are maintained by the farmers in the area, whether it's crops or hay, and so that's always a good acceptable use today of the corridors.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Any more questions, Caroline?
Yes, we have a lot of questions.
Okay,
And,
I'll let you keep feeding them then.
I'm going to start with the more sort of general ones. So I'm just going to run through them. So a question, what are the environmental consequences of the process of manufacturing solar panels? Can anyone speak to that?
I mean, I'll throw that one to Fortunat. You probably are the best connected on that one, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a manufactured product, like most anything else we build, and the impacts vary depending on where they are made and by whom. In general, the biggest impact is that it does require some energy input in order to make a solar panel. And so one of the questions we often hear from customers is, how long does it take to make back the energy that created that solar panel? And the answer is a couple of years of solar production. So, a solar panel that has a 25 or a 30-year life takes, between 1 and 3 years of life before it has sort of paid its energy debt in the embodied energy that is in the panel.
Yeah.
Other than that, it's again, solar is made up of silicon, which is sand, highly refined, but sand, glass, aluminum, and whatever the backsheet material is, which is sometimes plastic and sometimes glass. And so there's in a typical solar panel that we're seeing in solar Maine, there's nothing particularly exotic in there.
Yeah, I've heard people say toxic solar panels. Is that just a misnomer? Are people misinformed about calling solar panels toxic?
There is a type of solar panel, thin film solar panel, that is used in some utility scale projects, which are cadmium telluride solar panels, and cadmium is a toxic substance. It is, again, it's encapsulated in solar panels. As long as the solar panel is treated properly at the end of life, there's no environmental consequences. But I think when people talk about toxic solar panels, that's what they're talking about, and they often conflate that with silicon solar, which is what I think everything in Maine and the vast majority of all the solar in the US.
Right. So a silicon solar panel doesn't have any toxic metals in it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, great. Any more
Okay.
questions, Caroline?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
And can solar farms be built along existing power line corridors?
Well, Adam, you get to that one, right? I mean, that's where you want them to be.
Absolutely, and they have been currently. The one I mentioned in Farmington is built adjacent to an existing corridor with multiple transmission lines in it, and I think there's other ones that are the one that Brooke mentioned in Unity Plantation is another one that's adjacent to a large corridor with a substation right there. And then there's others that are either sited or in construction across the state that are next to transmission line corridors.
I mean, wouldn't you say in general, people have an incentive to be close to a transmission or distribution system because it's going to save them money, right?
Correct. If there's available capacity, the closer the better. Yep.
Yeah.
Right. I
Well,
don't know of
from a
anyone
safety-
building in the power line right away itself, in part because that needs to be open for access, for service and reliability, and then also it's complicated because the utility owns that land, and the utility in Maine can't be a participant in the solar projects.
And so somewhat related, how does a community or town find out if there is room at a close enough local substation for more power at the small DG project level? And sort of a related question, are we building enough substations and are we building them in the right places?
Oh, Adam, that seems right in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, so the maps I mentioned earlier are really the best reference to figure out what's available for capacity on especially the distribution system and where it makes the most economical sense to build these solar farms and connect them to the system. As far as building enough substations, at CMP alone, we have over 250 substations across the system, and more being built every year to interconnect projects such as this. So if there's a need, one will get built, and potentially an existing line gets broken into two smaller lines, and a substation gets built. So that's really how they work. And if there's a need and the economics work for the developer, that's what we do.
And this is a little bit sort of higher level, and I think someone spoke to this a little bit, but could someone speak to the solar goals set by the Maine Climate Council by the Maine Won't Wait program, and what kind of progress is being made towards realizing them?
Yeah, so fortunate you're on the Climate Council, right? Brooke, are you involved with that as well, or?
I'm not. I'm watching
Okay.
from afar.
Okay, so fortunate you probably have a front row seat there, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm specifically on the equity subcommittee of the Climate Council, so we have a particular challenge of looking at the energy transition through the equity lens. But the Climate Council has a goal to get Maine to 100% renewable energy by 2050, and that includes all end use electricity, all end use energy, right? So that is basically electrifying all end use electricity and then making it all from renewables. And so the numbers I cited before is that Maine currently uses about 12,000 gigawatt hours of electricity a year. Once you electrify all heating and transportation, that number about triples, and so we will expect to be using about 40,000 gigawatt hours of electricity per year by 2040, 2050. And to make that all from renewables is a pretty hefty challenge. If we think that solar is going to produce about a third of that, which I think is the sort of best estimate, that's the 7,500 megawatts of solar of all scales that we will need by 2040-ish.
Could you put that in perspective for us? How much do we have now and how much do we need by 2050? Is it a factor of 1,000? Is it a factor of 10,000? Is it doubling? Like what is it?
We have, so total to date in Maine, we have 500 and change megawatts of solar installed.
And they produce how many megawatt hours or gigawatt hours per year?
So 500 megawatts probably makes about 7,000 megawatt hours a year.
Okay.
So
So we're at 7,000 megawatt hours and we need to get to 12 million megawatt hours. Is that what you said?
40,000.
40,000 meg. So we're at 7,000. We need to get to 40,000. Is that where we're getting?
No, so sorry, something in that number is not right. So we have about 500 megawatts nameplate capacity. We need about 7,500 megawatts. So we have about a factor of 12 or 15 to grow.
Okay,
in
gotcha.
total over the next 20 years.
Okay, so
and the other way to think about that is we need to be adding about 500 megawatts a year each year for the next.
so
20
adding as much as we have now, we have and add just as much more year by year. Is that what you're saying, basically?
Yeah, yep, that's
Okay.
about right. And that seems like a lot, although when you look at the 500 megawatts we have today, more than half that has been added in the last 2 years. So we are,
Yeah.
are moving in the right direction, if not quite fast enough.
Yeah. And so it sounds, Adam, from your numbers, we have this in the queue. People are stepping up and we're on pace if these projects get built to actually maybe even exceed that number, right?
Yeah, correct. Yep.
Yeah. And Brooke, what's your sense of how long these projects take? If I have the idea tomorrow, hey, I want to build a solar farm, how long would it take me to go from, okay, idea to I'm enjoying the power? What's the time scale for most solar farms?
I'll have to ask Adam that question.
I guess it does depend on CMP a little bit, right? They're
It
the
very much
gatekeepers.
depends on the ability to interconnect to CMP.
Yeah.
From a development perspective, a developer finds the land and does their preliminary analysis and things like that, to getting through the permitting process. I would say 9 months.
No kidding.
Once they
Less
have
than a
their
year.
permit, then 4 months, 5 months to construct, and then they plug in.
So really, this is
assuming that they have everything cleared with CMP.
Yeah, this is much faster than your traditional power plant then, because I'm familiar with, how long it takes to site and get up to speed like a gas peaker plant. That's going to be much longer time frame. So we really, if I'm hearing you correctly, this is an achievable goal for Maine. I mean, there's no technical barrier to putting that much solar onto the grid, or am I missing something?
I think the barriers are policy barriers.
Okay.
Because if you think about the acreage that's involved, DEP has permitted more than 8,000 acres of solar in the last 3 years. That's a lot of acreage. And if what we're going to do is increase that, then we've got more and more and more and more acres. So we need to look at offshore wind from a process perspective, getting things sited. I've done a dozen onshore wind projects. Those take, 3 years to get going. And offshore wind is going to take even longer to get plugged in and built and on the grid. So solar is fairly fast compared to other renewable energy that's under active consideration. I still hold out great hope for hydrogen as a storage vehicle, as a way to take any excess renewable energy we have and store it. So there's lots of things on the horizon. The efficiency of panels, important that you mentioned that. In 5 years, who knows what the efficiency of panels will be, but a lot more than it is now.
Yeah, I bet fortunately I could guess because it's been pretty steady and linear. So it's not, I don't think it's an unknown quantity, but you're right. There may be some unexpected technological breakthrough, but I'm just kind of curious about that number. So it's 3 years, you said, to do a wind project and only about a year and change to do a solar project. It sounded like you thought that might change though. If we could do three times as many solar projects per every wind project, why wouldn't we try to double down on solar and get it done that way? What's the holdup with just really going all in and helping Adam be really good at what he's doing and just really streamlining the solar process if it's already that much faster? Why would we want to muck around with this longer time frame with wind? What's the thinking there?
Because we're Maine.
Okay.
Because every time we have an opportunity and we see that all right, here's the direction we want to go in. We're hyper local, and home rule is a very big part of how our state operates. We have many moratoria on solar projects. We have many towns that have enacted ordinances that are so restrictive that no one could really develop a solar project there. We're having this discussion now to educate people, hopefully, about what solar projects are or are not. But many people think they're a blight on the landscape, and we should do whatever we can to stop them. Which is the typical debate that happens in Maine anytime there's a substantial change. And this really has been a substantial change. This is unprecedented as far as the number of new projects that have appeared on the scene in the last 2 to 3 years. And so there's always a backlash to that kind of thing. So I think that the pace will slow.
Yeah, good point.
And
Adam, what do you think? Is it unsustainable? The pace is so rapid that it's just can't keep going?
Well, I think in what Fred mentioned, or Brooke mentioned, I mean, the timeline to develop on the developer side of solar farm is a year and a half. But if it requires, say, building a new transmission line or building a new substation, especially at the bulk power system level, there's quite an approval process and study process that has to happen with ISO New England to make that happen. And then you have federal and state permits that need to be issued. A lot of the materials that you need to build transmission lines and substations have 2-year lead times. So, I mean, when you get into upgrading the transmission system, it can definitely add quite a bit of time to the length of a project.
Gotcha.
Fred, I'd love to just weigh in really quick on the land.
Yeah,
use
please.
question.
Yeah.
It's true that solar takes a relatively large amount of land, although it treads fairly lightly on that land. I think it's worth keeping in context, though. I mean, 7,500 megawatts of solar is 22,000-ish acres. That's 0.1% of Maine's land. Maine is lots of things, but land poor is not one of them, right? And so, I mean, currently, golf courses in the U.S. occupy enough space to provide 370 gigawatts of solar, right? And so I don't think that total land, and that's not to discount that we should be thoughtful about where we put it, but we will not run out of land putting solar in Maine.
Yeah. Well, thanks for helping me put that scale in perspective. Caroline, I see you back on the call. What's up? You want to ask more questions or?
I'd like to. There are a lot of questions here, and we're closing in on 8:30, and I want to let everybody get back to their evenings at 8:30. So can we go into like a rapid fire question answering session?
Sounds great. You
Absolutely.
guys mind? Let's do it.
I'm going to skip some of the ones that are a little bit more specific to people's individual situations, just in the interest of getting to the ones that are a little more broad in terms of interest. So there are a couple of questions about battery or pump storage. Is that happening in Maine yet? Are there any battery or pump storage facilities in Maine, or is that coming?
Adam, you want to talk to us about? We've got a bunch of them already.
Yeah, so there is some battery storage in Maine. It's something that's being looked at. I don't think it's really taken off like solar has, but I see momentum there. And there's definitely a need both behind the meter at the residential level and then also at the larger grid level.
Okay.
And just a quick word about battery storage. I have several battery storage clients that are poking around in Maine, and you can take 100 megawatts of energy and store it on 5 acres. So it's a fairly small footprint. It's a short-term solution for storage, but I think it's part of the future for Maine.
Someone's asking about emissions from the sum of materials that go into solar farms, particularly concrete for mounting panels, steel, and other materials. You spoke to this a little bit. Fortunat, did that cover this, including the concrete? I think you were mostly talking about panels and metal.
Right. Most solar projects are not built using concrete. The ones that are tend to be the ones that are on landfills. So it's one of those interesting trade-offs. In most solar projects, you're pounding posts into the ground or drilling screws into the ground to mount the solar panels. On landfills or otherwise contaminated sites where you're not allowed to penetrate the ground, we build on ballast, and sometimes that ballast is concrete. And obviously, concrete has a high greenhouse gas footprint. Still vanishingly small compared to the lifetime savings of the solar project. But one of the things we've done recently with the last couple of landfill projects we built is to use a gabion, sort of a wire box filled with rocks as ballast instead of concrete, and that reduces again the emissions footprint of that project. It adds a little bit of cost and complexity, but for those projects, it was worth it. And all these things. I mean, the land use question too. Why not build on parking lots? Why not build on previously developed land? Partly it's about available space, but mostly it's about dollars and cents. And so, we have to balance sort of the very cheapest solar against the kinds of land use questions that we value as a state. We have to figure out what the right balance is. We need to build a lot of solar at all scales, but we should be thoughtful about where we're putting it.
Yeah, there was a question about why, particularly in the more urbanized states, so say Massachusetts, why isn't there more solar on rooftops and over parking lots? And wouldn't shading parking lots have some benefits?
Totally. And there is more and more. And a lot of states like Massachusetts actually incentivize that. So they will pay you more for a solar project built on a parking lot than one built on a creek. And I think inevitably, Maine has to create a policy that is differentiated that way if it wants to incentivize those projects, because they are going to be more expensive. They do add some value because they tend to be located closer to load, and so they add some resilience value and maybe distribution deferral value. But Maine has to make a choice to prioritize that kind of development.
Is anyone else fortunate? Is fortunate breaking up for us, or is that just me?
Oh, you're breaking up, I think, more than other folks are. Sorry. I'm getting a good feed from the other panelists.
Oh, sorry. I have another question. Someone's noting that solar panels are located along the roadside and near exits in other states. Why not in Maine? I may have something to do with access to distribution or transmission lines.
Have you been to Augusta lately? Take a trip up and you'll see several interchanges that are currently being constructed, and they should be sort of fully constructed in the next 2 to 3 months.
And my understanding is that DOT is interested in doing that in other rights of way, where it's appropriate.
But electrical connection is part of the mix. You need to have a place where you can plug them in without having to spend a lot of money running miles and miles and miles to plug in.
And back to the parking lot issue, why there are certainly some very large parking lots. Why aren't those used for small solar projects?
It's just expensive. And so if you don't value the covered parking for its own sake, it's hard to justify building solar there as opposed to in a field. It costs about 25% more because the structure is more robust. The panels are higher. The importance is higher because your people and cars are under, and so it's just more steel, more engineering. That's the only reason.
Here's a question about the shade, and I assume this applies to sort of either agricultural or natural settings. The shade cast by panels must change the ecosystem of the site. And so, and there's a mowing and maintenance schedule. Is this a problem? And I just want to interject that as part of our climate series earlier, we had a fellow on whose name escapes me, but he actually is building a business around grazing animals, around solar arrays. And one of the neat things, it was Michael Dennett, one of the neat things that he pointed out was that his animals can get under the panels in ways that is difficult for machinery. And they're improving the site with their waste, and And the panels provide shade. So I don't know, are any of you familiar with what scale the grazing around panels is taking place?
Yeah, Michael, I think his business called Crescent Run Farm, they do vegetation management on a couple of our larger projects. As Brooke said, it's challenging because DEP actually doesn't love it because they would rather you mow with gasoline than mow with sheep, and I think that's
Yeah.
something we gotta work on over time. But it's because they worry about the grazing paths and the effect on runoff and things like that.
Yeah, Brooke, you want any color to that? You are a DEP yourself. What's the DEP's thinking there?
DEP has very strict stormwater rules here in Maine to protect our lakes and rivers and streams. And those stormwater rules are very concerned with both the quality and quantity of stormwater runoff from anything, from a parking lot, from a farm field, anything that creates a pathway for stormwater runoff. Think of game trails, or in this case, sheep trails. Combine that with the pollutants associated with the sheep dung, and you've got a recipe for a high phosphorus runoff from a solar project. That's their primary concern. I think it can be worked around, but that is a concern that they have. And I will say, back to the original question, Caroline, putting a solar project in definitely changes the ecology of the site. There's going to be different critters that are going to be under the panels, around the panels, but in many cases, it is going to be maybe a net positive, because of not only is the area within the fence line where the panels are, but areas are cleared on either side and to the south of the panel area in order to, so you don't have shading on the panels. Those areas are allowed to grow up into sort of a shrubby mix, the kind of mix that Adam was talking about under power lines. And in something that was just a monolithic forest, now has a meadow, has shrub around the edges, and has forest as well. So there's a more complex ecology that can be established associated with solar projects.
Great. Hey, Caroline, I see we're about 4 minutes away from the end here.
Yeah,
I wondered if you maybe had one more question, and then we could let our panelists say any final words they want to share, and then maybe do a final sort of poll and see how people feel now, if there's any change in that feeling about solar farms.
yeah. I think there were a couple of questions from people who are, and this isn't totally within the sort of the purview of our topic, but who are challenged by the many different options of community solar projects, and they're struggling to decide which way they should go. And I guess they're mostly asking for, is there a resource that you can, someone could direct them to help them differentiate between the pros and cons of those different companies, models, and I'm not sure how to ask that question, but
Yeah. Well, let's give Horton a chance to jump in, because you guys basically sell solar in every form, right? Like, if I want to buy solar, like any way you want to sell it to me, you can slice and dice it in many different ways. You want to just give us a quick run through about all the different options?
Sure, I was going to say the easy answer is, buy it from us. It's obviously the best. But there are lots of different ways to buy solar, including community solar, right? So for offsite solar, the two primary offerings that are in the market is an ownership-based community solar project where you actually own your portion of the solar project and you benefit from all the energy that it produces, and then a subscription-based where somebody else owns the project. Therefore, you don't have to spend any money up front, and what you get is essentially an assignment of some portion of the generation, and you're essentially seeing a 10 or 15% discount on your electric bill. So those are roughly the two options. 90% of the flyers you'll get in the mail are for the second option, and they're more or less indistinguishable. There is the Public Advocate does have on his website sort of a consumer's guide to community solar. It is frankly not very good, but it is, I think, the only state resource that I'm aware of that helps customers.
Okay.
And it's
Adam,
mostly a consumer's disclosure kind of a question.
right. Does CMP help at all? I know you must get tons of questions at CMP, because especially anybody who moves here from anywhere else, they're used to getting their power from the utility, but you don't sell it. But do you have any resources, or does CMP point people to the competitive energy market in any way?
Yeah, I would, just like Fortunate said, I would point people to the Public Advocate's office
Okay.
for questions. We
Mhm.
do have some resources on our website that explain basically what Fortunate just explained.
Mhm.
But yeah, we don't supply energy. We just deliver it. So it's really a question of the customer, if they want to subscribe to the standard offer that everybody gets, or look to see some savings and subscribe to a community solar project. So.
Mhm. Okay, Brooke, do you have any insight into where people can go to get that question answered?
I don't. I get the flyers all the time and I ask the same question.
Yeah, all right. Caroline, that might be all. I've got 8:29 on my clock. Guys, I really wanted to thank you, each of you, for sharing your time and expertise. It really, I learned a lot tonight. I hope people who are watching did. I don't know if we have time to do a final poll before we say goodnight, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Caroline.
Sure, we can put it up there. See what we get. There we go. I'll just give people a minute to.
We still have 70 people listening, so that's good. We started with 90, so we only lost about 10%, 20% of our audience.
All right, so with most people responding, I'm going to put that up. So a few opposed, 3%, and most leaning or in favor. So any parting words, Fred, or any of you parting words?
I'll just say thank you to Fred and Caroline and Priya for putting this on. This is awesome. This is the thing to do. Get the discussion going and just educate ourselves about what's going on.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for showing up. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but there were a lot of them, and we felt it was important to set the stage a little bit with some context and some background. So I will send a link to the recording. So if some things were confusing, you can listen again, and we may send out a survey to see what you thought and what additional topics, solar or otherwise, you might be interested in the future. So many thanks to all of you. Hope everybody has a good rest of the evening, and that's it.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks again.
Great.
Thank you.
Good
Have a good
night.
night.